When my husband's car pulled into the driveway 3 days early, the headlights sliced across the yard and froze me in place. He wasn't supposed to be home until Friday. That was the plan. I had been counting on those extra days, those few precious hours of breathing room that suddenly evaporated in the glow of his high beams. I stood there by the fence, the damp boards still smelling of fresh paint, and for a moment I couldn't move, couldn't even blink. He saw me standing there, and worse, he saw who was standing next to me. His gaze caught the unfinished hammer on the ground, the flashlight leaning against the fence post, and then landed on my face. My pulse hammered louder than the engine he had just turned off. My mouth went dry. I could almost see the dots connecting in his head, a slow, creeping realization he didn't want to believe. He opened his door, didn't speak, didn't slam it shut. He just looked. That silence was worse than any yell. I felt my stomach twist as if my body was betraying me, dragging me back to every moment that had led us here, every glass of water carried out to the fence, every idle conversation about broken boards, every second I let myself drift closer to something I shouldn't have. Yes, he saw us together now, under the harsh wash of those headlights. But he didn't see everything. He didn't see the mornings when the house felt too big and too quiet. He didn't see the evenings when my words bounced off the walls, unanswered. He didn't see the small, slow erosion of boundaries, or the part of me that had been begging, silently, for something to change. 3 months ago, it started with a simple offer to fix a fence. 3 months ago, I didn't think anything of it. But now, standing frozen in my own yard, I felt the weight of every choice like wet concrete around my ankles. You deserve to know how it happened. All of it. Every crack, every glance, every word that built this moment. Because nothing happens all at once, even this. I always believed silence was harmless, even comforting. Our home was quiet in a way people admired. Guests would say, "It's so peaceful here," and I'd smile, serving tea in porcelain cups, nodding like I agreed. But in truth, that silence wasn't peaceful anymore, it was heavy. It settled over the house like dust, soft but suffocating, coating every corner of my days until I forgot what it felt like to laugh unexpectedly or to have a conversation that wasn't scheduled like a doctor's appointment. My husband had built that silence, unintentionally, over years of busy mornings and late nights. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't cold. He simply wasn't there, not in the way that mattered. He was always on his way somewhere, a flight to catch, a call to return, a project that just needed another week. He left lists taped to the fridge, reminders about bills and groceries, polite notes that felt more like instructions than connection. When he left for another trip that spring, I told myself I didn't mind. I watched his taillights disappear down the street, the car turning the corner, and the silence rolled back in like fog. That was when I noticed the fence. The boards along the back of the yard had begun to sag, some splitting, others leaning as if even they were tired of holding the line. It wasn't dramatic, just another small thing that needed tending to. I called a handyman. He didn't show. I stared at the fence that evening, wondering if it would wait another week, when I heard a voice from over the hedge. "Looks like that fence of yours is giving up." He was my neighbor, the kind of man who fixed things with his own hands, the kind who kept a toolbox in the back of his truck and didn't make a fuss about it. We'd exchanged polite nods before, nothing more. He asked if I wanted help, casual, like he was asking if I needed the salt passed across a table. I could have said no. I almost did. But the words came out differently. "That would be nice. Thank you." It started simply. He came by the next morning with a few tools and a roll of gloves tucked under his arm. I brought him water, the way any neighbor might, and told myself that's all it was. But when I handed him the glass, he smiled. Not politely, not like my husband's quick distracted smile before he left for the airport, but slowly, warmly, as if he actually saw me. The fence became the excuse. Every day there was another loose board, another post to straighten, another hour spent in the yard. I stood nearby, holding nails, passing tools, brushing sawdust from the hem of my sweater. It was harmless, I told myself. People fix fences. Neighbors talk. But somewhere between the clink of his hammer and the low hum of his voice, something shifted. I began waking earlier than usual, pressing my hand against the kitchen counter while the kettle hissed, peeking through the curtain to see if his truck was already in his driveway. I found reasons to step outside, to carry out another glass of water, to stand by the fence a little longer than necessary. The first time it rained, he came anyway. The drizzle made the boards slick, and we stood under the narrow cover of the awning. He shook rain from his shoulders, and we shared the kind of small talk that doesn't mean anything until it suddenly does. I should have gone back inside when the clouds thickened. Instead, I stayed. He told me he liked working with his hands because you could see progress, a fence mended, a wall repaired, not like office jobs where nothing ever really felt finished. His words landed heavier than he probably meant them to. I thought of my own life, my carefully curated routines, the way every day felt like I was maintaining something that would never feel done. The rain tapped on the awning. I laughed at something he said, really laughed, the kind of laugh that felt rusty and used. He looked at me, eyes lingering for half a second too long, and I felt it, that tiny, undeniable crack in the silence I had been living in for years. I told myself it was just conversation, just neighborly kindness, just a fence. But when I went back inside, the house felt even quieter than before, and for the first time in a long time, the silence wasn't just heavy, it was unbearable. The rain didn't stop for 2 days, soft and steady, soaking into the soil until the air smelled of wet earth and cedar. The fence, half mended, stood like a question between our yards, boards leaning at odd angles, a visual reminder of something in progress. I kept looking at it from the kitchen window, pretending I was just checking for damage, when really I was waiting for him. He came back anyway, hood pulled over his head, gloves already damp from the walk across his yard. He carried a tarp, a hammer, and the same unhurried expression that made me feel like he had all the time in the world for things that most people rushed through. I stepped outside without a jacket, telling myself I just wanted to bring him an umbrella, but the truth was, I couldn't stand watching from behind the glass anymore. The rain pattered against my sleeves, darkening the fabric until it clung to my arms, but I didn't go back for anything warmer. Instead, I stood next to him under the narrow cover of the awning, the space so tight our shoulders nearly touched. He spoke about the wood, about how moisture seeps into cracks and makes them worse if you don't seal them quickly. His words were about the fence, but something about them felt sharper, as if he wasn't only talking about splintering boards. The closeness felt strange at first, like stepping into a room you weren't invited to, but after a while, I stopped fidgeting with my sleeves. We worked quietly, the rain filling the gaps in conversation, until he handed me a bucket to hold steady while he hammered a loose nail. My hands were slick from the rain, and when he reached to steady the bucket, his fingers brushed over mine. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even deliberate. But the warmth of his touch felt electric against the cold. I didn't move away immediately. Neither did he. For a breath or two, our hands stayed like that, touching lightly, the rain falling harder as if to cover the moment. Then, almost instinctively, I let out a laugh, too quick, too awkward, and said something about the weather, though I couldn't have repeated the words if I tried. He smiled in response, and for a moment, I saw something in that expression that unsettled me. It wasn't forward or bold. It wasn't even flirtation in the obvious sense. It was just open. The rain drummed against the tarp, and the boards between us and the open yard blurred in the downpour. I don't remember who leaned closer first. Maybe it was both of us. Maybe it was inevitable in that narrow space, with the rain hemming us in and the fence a half-built wall behind us. We kissed. It lasted only a second, maybe two. When we pulled back, we didn't speak. He looked down at the ground, wiping a smear of rain from his face with the back of his wrist, and I stared at the hammer in his hand like it had answers. The air between us felt thicker after that, as though the rain itself had turned heavy. I told myself it was nothing, an accident, a moment that meant less than it felt. People get caught in the closeness of bad weather, don't they? It's human. It's harmless. But when I stepped back inside, dripping water across the clean kitchen tiles, I couldn't shake the feeling of his lips on mine. The house smelled like brewed coffee and damp air, familiar scents, yet I felt like I had walked into someone else's life. I changed into dry clothes, folded the wet ones neatly, and sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the faint smudge of rainwater on my sleeve. The sound of the rain outside was steady, like it always had been, but now I heard it differently, like it was reminding me of something I couldn't undo. Later, when my husband called, I almost didn't answer. The phone lit up, his name flashing on the screen, and for one heartbeat I thought about letting it ring out. Instead, I picked up and listened to his voice talk about hotel check-ins, the late dinner he'd had with a client, the weather in another city. I answered where I should, murmured where I was expected to, and when the call ended, the silence in the house returned, thicker than before. I lay awake that night listening to the rain, thinking about the fence and the tarp and the narrow space under the awning. I thought about how his hand had brushed mine, how we hadn't moved away, and how quickly that space between us had disappeared. I told myself it was meaningless. I told myself it wouldn't happen again. But somewhere in the middle of the night, as I stared at the ceiling, I realized I was waiting for the rain to stop, because I knew when it did, he'd be back, and I'd find myself outside again, pretending I had reasons. The rain stopped the next morning, leaving the air cool and heavy, the yard slick with puddles that reflected a pale sky. I stood by the window longer than necessary, pretending to check the weather, but my eyes kept tracing the damp boards of the fence. The spot where we had stood yesterday, under the narrow overhang, pressed close by the rain, felt branded into the yard, even though there was no sign of it. When I stepped outside, the smell of wet soil and wood hit me. The boards were darker from the rain, the hammer still leaning where it had been set down, as if the moment we shared had been left hanging in the air with the tools. I told myself I should feel awkward. I should feel nervous, guilty, even ashamed. But the strangest thing was how ordinary it all seemed in the daylight. I picked up a stray glove he had left behind, still damp from the rain, and laid it on the porch rail to dry. The glove looked lonely there, and somehow that small detail made me think about him more than the kiss had. He showed up before noon, boots leaving wet prints on the grass. He carried more tools, and when our eyes met, there was no fumbling for words, no obvious mention of yesterday. He just nodded and asked about the boards, like nothing had happened. But everything had happened. I could feel it in the way I moved, slower, more deliberate, as if each gesture might give something away. I held the ladder steady as he climbed it, noticing how close his boots were to my hands. I brushed sawdust from my sleeves, suddenly aware of every speck, every small thing I did in his presence. The conversations shifted in tone. At first they were still about wood and nails, about which sections of the fence needed the most attention. But then he mentioned his sister's garden in passing, and I found myself asking about it. I shared a memory about my father teaching me to plant tomatoes, something I hadn't thought of in years. These weren't confessions. They were fragments, but they added up. It wasn't about the fence anymore, not really. It was about standing outside longer than necessary, letting the air between us fill with words that weren't about work. Later that afternoon, I caught myself looking at the clock. I hadn't done that in a long time, not like this, not with that quiet anticipation that made the minutes feel heavier. I noticed how the light changed across the kitchen floor, how the smell of freshly cut wood clung to my sweater even after I went inside. I wasn't used to this version of myself. I had spent years moving through routines like muscle memory, efficient and detached. Now there was a small shift, barely visible but undeniable. I washed dishes that evening, staring out the window at the silhouette of the fence in the fading light. The boards looked straighter already, stronger, as if they were holding some secret. When the phone rang, I answered on the second ring. My husband's voice filled the kitchen, brisk but familiar, asking about errands and weather and small things. I answered each question as I always did, yet there was a quiet difference in how I heard myself speak. I didn't mention the rain, or the ladder, or the hours outside. I didn't mention him. After the call, the silence in the kitchen was sharp, almost brittle. I stood there for a long moment, hands resting on the counter, staring at nothing. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house creaked the way it always had, the wind moving through the trees, the refrigerator humming. But my mind wouldn't settle. I thought about the way he looked at the broken boards, the way he handled the tools, the way his voice lowered when he said something not entirely about the fence. I thought about how we hadn't mentioned the kiss, how neither of us needed to. The absence of words was louder than any admission. I wondered if tomorrow he would come again, and if I would go outside again, and what excuse I would give myself for both. By the fourth morning, the fence no longer looked like a simple repair project. It had become a kind of ritual, something I woke up thinking about before my feet even touched the floor. The boards that leaned, the posts that wobbled, the way the sunlight fell across the damp earth where he had worked the day before, all of it felt like a quiet invitation to step outside. I made coffee, standing at the kitchen counter with my fingers wrapped around the mug, staring through the window. The yard was still wet in patches, and the fence was half finished, a jagged line of new wood beside old, the edges uneven like a wound that hadn't fully healed. I told myself I was just paying attention to the details, that I had always noticed things like this. But that wasn't true. The truth was that my world had grown smaller in recent years. The house, the yard, the occasional trips to the grocery store, everything existed in the same small loop. My husband's absences didn't create space for new things, they simply made the old ones feel heavier. The days were measured by lists, the kind he left on the counter with neat handwriting and tiny checkboxes that waited for my pen. When he left this time, I thought it would be the same. I thought the silence would stretch, that I'd fill it with errands and dusting and the same background music I'd been playing for years. But the fence changed that. Or maybe it was him. He arrived again, right on time, his truck rumbling to a stop at the curb. The sound of his boots on the wet grass was strangely reassuring, as though his presence had become part of the day's structure. He carried a different set of tools this time, heavier ones, and when he set them down on the porch, they made a solid, grounding thud. He asked about the garage door in passing, his voice casual, as if he'd just noticed it sagged slightly when I opened it. I admitted I had been meaning to get it fixed for months. He shrugged lightly and said he could look at it after the fence. The offer was practical, harmless on the surface, but it felt like something else, a quiet expansion of his place in my world. The garage smelled like it always did, a faint mix of dust, old paint cans, and the faint trace of oil from a mower that hadn't been used in weeks. But with him there, it felt different. He stood in the doorway for a moment, his shoulders framed by the light, before stepping in and examining the hinges, the way the door shifted slightly on its frame. I stood nearby, arms crossed lightly over my chest, watching him move around the space that had been mine for years. His voice was low as he explained how the door had warped over time, the kind of problem that happens slowly until one day you notice it all at once. I nodded, listening, though I wasn't really hearing just the words. There was something about being in that garage together that felt separate from the rest of the house, like stepping into a different rhythm. The air smelled sharper there, and the light through the single dusty window turned everything a softer shade. He leaned over the door to check the bolts, and for a brief second, I caught myself staring, not in a way I could justify easily, not in a way that had anything to do with hinges or wood. I looked away quickly, picking up a rag from the workbench just to have something to hold, but the thought lingered like an echo. We talked about small things, about the rain the day before, about how the wood on the fence would dry unevenly if we didn't treat it soon. But between those ordinary sentences, there were pauses that seemed heavier than the words themselves. When he left that afternoon, the garage door moved more smoothly, and the fence had 3 new boards. But the work wasn't the thing I thought about as I watched him walk back across the yard. Later, when I came back inside, I noticed how quiet the house felt again. It wasn't a new kind of silence, exactly, but it pressed harder now, like it was reminding me of itself. I sat at the kitchen table, fingers tracing the grain of the wood, and realized I could still smell the faint scent of sawdust on my sweater. I thought about the way he had stood in the garage doorway, the way his voice had sounded different there. I thought about how quickly I had said yes when he offered to help. That night, when I turned off the lights and went upstairs, the house felt larger than it ever had, each room a little darker, each step up the staircase a little slower. I told myself that tomorrow he would come again, and I would stand by the fence again, and maybe we'd finish the work. But deep down, I knew it wasn't really about the fence anymore. It hadn't been for days. The next morning started the same as the others had, but it felt different somehow. I made coffee, poured it into the same chipped mug I always used, and stared out at the yard. The fence stretched across the grass like a half-finished thought, boards uneven, the new wood brighter against the old. But I didn't just see the fence. I saw every moment we'd spent out there, the rain under the awning, the quiet pauses in the garage, the brush of his fingers on mine, and I felt the weight of those moments in my chest. I wasn't expecting him that early, but his truck pulled up just as the coffee finished brewing. I caught myself smoothing the hem of my sweater before I stepped outside, something I hadn't done in years, and hated how natural it felt. He was carrying a box of screws and a smaller hammer this time, moving with that steady, deliberate way he always did. He didn't look surprised to see me already waiting at the edge of the porch. He didn't say much at first, just nodded and started laying out what he'd brought. There was comfort in the rhythm we'd fallen into of me holding things, him explaining what needed to be done next, but beneath it there was something else, something unspoken. Every time our hands met when I passed him a tool, every time his shoulder brushed mine as we worked side by side, I felt that flicker of awareness. I told myself I should break the silence, say something ordinary, remind us both that this was just a neighbor helping with repairs. But instead, I told him a story. It was about the first house my husband and I lived in, a small place with crooked windows and an old oak tree in the yard. I hadn't thought about that house in years, but as I talked, the memories came back, the way the roof leaked when it rained, the summer nights when we'd sit on the porch with lemonade, the way we used to laugh at how small the kitchen felt when we cooked together. He listened without interrupting, his hands still working, his focus steady but not detached. When I paused, he looked up and said quietly, "You don't smile like that very often anymore." The words landed like a stone in water, quiet, but rippling outward. We kissed. It wasn't planned. It wasn't dramatic. It happened the way an exhale slips out without thinking. And when it was over, there was a stillness between us that felt louder than anything we could have said. I didn't apologize. Neither did he. He went back to his work, fitting the new board into place, and I stood there holding a handful of screws, staring at the way the sun caught the dust in the air. My heart felt like it was beating too close to the surface, like everyone could see it. When he finally stepped back from the fence, brushing wood shavings off his gloves, I found myself looking for something to say and finding nothing. There was no easy way to name what had just happened, and maybe that was better. The rest of the day passed in fragments. I helped where I could, passing him the drill, steadying the ladder, holding nails between my fingers like they might burn me. We didn't talk about the kiss, but we didn't avoid each other's eyes either. When he left that afternoon, the fence had another row of boards, straighter and cleaner, but I couldn't look at it the same way. I went inside, set my sweater over the chair, and caught my reflection in the kitchen window. I didn't look like the woman who had stood there a week ago, staring at the same fence, waiting for something she couldn't name. I looked different, subtly, but undeniably. I smiled, and for the first time in years, I didn't recognize my own smile. By the 6th day, the fence had taken on a life of its own. It wasn't just wood and nails anymore, it had become the outline of my mornings, the excuse for every step I took outside, the reason I found myself lingering at the window with my coffee going cold in my hands. The yard looked different now. Where once it had been just a strip of grass bordered by sagging boards, now it felt like a meeting place, half private, half exposed. The air held the smell of fresh wood and damp soil, and that scent seemed to follow me even when I closed the door behind me. He came later that morning than usual, his truck pulling up with the sound of loose gravel crunching under the tires. I felt the flicker of anticipation when I heard it, even as I told myself I shouldn't. By the time he stepped onto the grass with another armful of tools, I was already at the porch, as if I'd been waiting there the whole time. The work continued, but slower now. The most obvious repairs had been done, the broken boards replaced, the posts straightened. What was left were the smaller tasks, smoothing edges, sealing gaps, details that could have been finished in a day or two if either of us had wanted that. But neither of us hurried. Each day seemed to bring new little things to fix, new reasons to stay outside. I found myself offering help before he asked. "Do you need the ladder? Should I hold that steady?" It wasn't about being useful, and I knew it. It was about standing close enough to feel the warmth of his arm brush mine when he leaned past me, close enough that the smell of sawdust and faint traces of soap on his skin reached me before I realized I was breathing it in. The conversations followed the same rhythm they had for days, but they were different too. He asked if I'd always lived in this house, and I told him about the years before, when we first bought it, when the garden had been full of flowers I'd let wither because life had gotten busy. He shared small pieces of his own story, little details about his family, the kind of things you don't usually tell someone you only see across a fence. I didn't think of it as confiding. Not yet. But I realized later that I'd begun to share things I hadn't said aloud in years. There were moments when the silence between us wasn't just comfortable, it was charged. I'd hand him a hammer and my fingers would brush his glove, and neither of us would move away too quickly. He'd stand behind me to steady the ladder, and I could feel the closeness like a hum beneath my skin. By afternoon, we were checking parts of the fence we'd already fixed, as though there might still be some flaw that needed attention. I knew what we were really doing. The guilt came in quiet waves, not constant but sharp when it hit. It came when I set my husband's dinner plate in the microwave later that evening, reheating something I'd cooked earlier, telling myself it was enough. It came when the phone rang and I answered with the same steady voice, saying the right words in the right order, while thinking of another voice entirely. When my husband asked, "How's the house?" I said, "Fine." When he asked, "How's the fence?" I said, "Almost done." And even as I said it, I thought about how those words weren't really true. The fence wasn't almost done, not because it needed more work, but because finishing it would mean something neither of us wanted to face yet. That night, I couldn't help but think about the way he had looked at me when he said, "This isn't just about the fence, you know." He hadn't said it as an accusation. He hadn't even said it like a question. It was just a statement, quiet and steady, and I hadn't answered. I'd only stood there, holding a handful of nails that felt heavier than they should, and stared at the boards between us, wondering how something as ordinary as fixing a fence had turned into this. The house felt different when I went back inside, like it knew something I hadn't admitted out loud. I stood by the window one last time before bed, looking out at the fence, the line between yards, and thought about how easy it had been to step across it. The morning felt heavier that day, like the air itself was aware of what had been building. I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had to, but because lying in bed felt impossible. The sheets were tangled around my legs, and the house was so still that I could hear the clock in the hallway ticking, each second pulling me further out of sleep and deeper into the day I wasn't sure I was ready for. The fence was nearly finished now. Only a few boards remained, stacked neatly by the edge of the yard, and that fact sat on my chest like weight. Once those boards were in place, there would be nothing left to work on, no reason for him to come by each morning with his tools and his calm voice. The thought left me unsettled in a way I didn't know how to name. I stood at the kitchen sink, coffee cooling in my hands, staring out the window as if the fence might look different today. But it didn't. The line of new wood was clean and steady, the old boards blending in more with each passing day. The progress should have been satisfying, but it felt like an ending I didn't want to reach. His truck arrived later than usual, the low hum of the engine breaking the morning stillness. My breath caught when I heard it, though I tried to pretend it hadn't. By the time he crossed the yard with a toolbox in one hand and a bundle of sandpaper in the other, I was already stepping outside, the screen door creaking behind me. He didn't say much at first, and neither did I. The silence between us wasn't awkward anymore. It had become something else entirely, an unspoken agreement, a kind of understanding that didn't need words to exist. We worked slowly, slower than ever. He smoothed edges that were already smooth. I handed him tools he didn't really need. Every movement felt stretched, as though we were both trying to hold back time by dragging out every small task. When the boards were finally set, he looked at the fence and then at me, as if to say, "There, it's done." But the words didn't come. And I didn't want them to. By late afternoon, we were no longer working at all. We stood near the shed, away from the house and the road, in that odd kind of half-light you only get when the sun starts to sink but hasn't yet touched the horizon. There was no conversation leading to it, no deliberate moment where we decided what to do next. There was only a pause, the kind of pause that feels like stepping across a line you can't uncross, and then it happened. We spent the night together. The words sound simple, almost small, but the reality wasn't small at all. It was something I hadn't expected to feel again, not in this stage of my life, not after all these years of routine and quiet. The next morning, the world looked exactly the same, but I didn't feel the same. The yard was still damp with dew, the fence stood straight and even, and the coffee tasted as bitter as always. But inside me, everything had shifted. I stood in the kitchen staring at the line of light creeping across the floor, hearing the house creak softly as it warmed with the day. It felt like the walls knew what had happened, like the very air in the house had changed. I thought of my husband, miles away but closer now, his voice from the phone still in my ears. I thought of the way I had said all the right things to him the night before, words that sounded steady even as something unsteady unfolded just beyond those walls. And I thought of the fence. The neat, finished boards, the line that was supposed to divide one yard from another, now standing as a reminder of how easily lines can blur. The day stretched on, long and quiet, and I couldn't stop thinking about how nothing, and everything, had changed. The morning after, the weight of what had happened clung to me like the scent of sawdust that still lingered on my clothes. The fence stood straight and unyielding, every board perfectly aligned, but to me, it felt almost mocking in its completeness. There was no more work to do. The excuse was gone. I made coffee, hands moving on autopilot, pouring water, measuring grounds, listening to the familiar hiss and drip. But my mind wasn't on the coffee or even on the kitchen. It was on the sound of his boots on the gravel, the quiet way he said good morning, the fact that I had no idea if he would come back today. The house was unbearably still. Even the refrigerator's hum seemed louder, the tick of the hallway clock sharper. I tried to busy myself, folded laundry that didn't need folding, wiped down already clean counters, but none of it dulled the echo in my head. When his truck finally pulled up, I felt my chest tighten. There was a part of me that expected him not to come, that thought maybe yesterday would be left as some unspoken thing, something neither of us would dare to face again. But there he was, walking across the grass like always, carrying nothing this time, no tools, no gloves, no ladder. He didn't look at the fence. He didn't need to. We stood there for a long moment, not speaking. The silence between us wasn't awkward, it was heavy, as if words would only make it worse. Eventually, he glanced toward the boards, the neatly finished line, and said, almost softly, "Looks like it's done." The sentence felt like more than it was. I nodded, though my throat felt too tight for anything more. The hours moved slowly after that. He stayed for a while, standing near the fence, talking about small things, how the ground would settle around the posts, how the stain should dry before any real rain hit it. I listened, nodding when I should, but my mind was elsewhere, tangled up in the weight of what we'd crossed into and what it meant now that the fence was finished. He left earlier than usual that day. When his truck disappeared around the corner, the yard felt hollow. I walked the length of the fence after he was gone, fingers brushing over the smooth boards. They were solid, seamless, almost perfect. But instead of pride in what had been fixed, I felt an ache I couldn't name. Later, my phone rang. My husband's name lit the screen, and I hesitated before answering. His voice was bright, distracted, talking about the meeting that had ended early, about how he might be coming home sooner than planned. "Maybe Thursday," he said, as if it were nothing. My stomach tightened. Thursday was 2 days away. I told him that was good, my voice steady even though my thoughts weren't. I asked about the weather where he was, about his flight schedule, anything to keep the words from catching in my throat. When the call ended, the house felt smaller somehow. Every wall, every corner, every carefully placed photo seemed to lean in closer, as if to ask what I thought I was doing. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window at the fence. The yard was quiet, the boards standing in their perfect line, but all I could see was how easy it had been to let the line between what was right and what wasn't blur. I went to bed knowing Thursday was coming fast, and with it, the end of pretending nothing had changed. The morning came earlier than I wanted, not because the sun rose any sooner, but because my mind wouldn't rest. I lay awake long before the light filtered through the curtains, staring at the ceiling, counting the hours until Thursday. My husband's voice from the night before still echoed in my ears, his casual mention of coming home a couple days early looping over and over like a recording I couldn't turn off. When I finally got up, the house felt different again, not in the way it had after he first left, or after the fence repairs had started, but heavier, as if it sensed the clock ticking louder with each passing hour. The coffee pot gurgled in the background, familiar and grounding, but even that small sound felt intrusive in the quiet. The fence stood outside the kitchen window, neat and finished. There was nothing left for anyone to do, nothing left for him to fix. And yet, I caught myself staring out the window like I always did, waiting for a sign of his truck, waiting for something that made less and less sense with each passing day. He came later that morning, but this time it wasn't the familiar rhythm of tools and work. There was no ladder, no box of nails, no wood shavings scattered at his feet. He just stood at the edge of the yard, hands in his pockets, the finished fence between us like a quiet reminder. I stepped outside without thinking, the screen door creaking as it always did. For a moment, we simply looked at each other. Neither of us moved closer, but neither of us stepped away. There was an unspoken understanding in the air, a shared awareness of the shift between yesterday and today, and of the reality waiting just around the corner. We talked, but only a little. He mentioned the weather, a comment about how the ground would settle after the last rain, and I nodded, grateful for the small talk even as it felt hollow. We both knew it wasn't about the weather. The pauses between our words said more than the sentences themselves. There was a weight to the silence, a kind of stillness that carried every choice we'd made, every moment that had led to now. He stayed for a while, longer than he needed to, but not as long as before. When he finally left, the sound of his truck fading down the street felt different this time. Final, almost. The house swallowed me when I stepped back inside. The walls felt closer, the air thicker. I moved through the rooms, touching objects I didn't need to touch, straightening picture frames, refolding dish towels, opening and closing drawers just to have something to do. In the afternoon, I called my husband without meaning to. My finger hovered over his name on the phone screen, and before I could stop myself, the call was already ringing through. He answered on the third ring, his voice as bright and steady as always, asking if everything was fine at home. I told him it was. The words came easily, but they didn't feel like mine. I found myself glancing at the clock more and more as the day went on. Every tick of the second hand felt louder, as though time itself was demanding an answer I wasn't ready to give. That evening, the fence caught the last of the sunlight, the boards glowing faintly before the shadows swallowed them. I stood at the window again, watching until it grew too dark to see, and thought about how something so ordinary had become the thing holding together, and pulling apart, the pieces of my life. When I went to bed, the silence wasn't comforting. It was a reminder. A reminder that tomorrow would come, and after that, Thursday, and nothing would ever be the same again. Thursday arrived sooner than I wanted, even though every moment leading up to it had dragged. I woke before dawn, not because of an alarm or a sound, but because my mind wouldn't let me stay asleep. The house was dark and still, but it felt different, like it knew what the day would bring. I lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the tick of the clock in the hallway, the almost imperceptible sound of branches scraping against the side of the house. Ordinary noises, but they felt louder somehow, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I got up before the sun rose. The air was cold against my bare feet as I walked down the stairs, my hand trailing along the banister, lingering on the smooth wood as if that familiar gesture might steady me. I made coffee, but I didn't drink it. I just held the cup, the warmth pooling in my hands, staring out the kitchen window. The fence stood outside, perfectly finished, each board straight and solid. It looked unremarkable now, just a fence, like it had been before all of this began, but to me it was impossible to see it that way. It held too much. I don't know what I expected that morning, or if I expected anything at all. I didn't think he would come again, not after the way we'd left things, not with my husband's return hanging in the air like a storm about to break. But part of me waited anyway, my eyes flicking toward the street with every distant engine sound, my breath catching whenever I thought I heard his truck. The morning stretched into afternoon. The day felt long and short at the same time, hours slipping past without meaning. I did things without thinking, folded laundry, watered plants that didn't need it, wiped down counters that were already clean, but none of it filled the space in my head. By late afternoon, I heard the familiar sound, tires on gravel, the slow rumble of a truck pulling up to the curb. My heart jumped in a way I couldn't control, and I hated how much it did. He didn't bring tools this time. He didn't bring gloves or sandpaper or anything that could be mistaken for work. He just stood by the fence, his hands in his pockets, his eyes meeting mine for a moment that felt longer than it should have. I stepped outside. The air was cool, the kind of late afternoon chill that hints at evening, and the sky had that faint golden haze before sunset. We didn't speak much. There wasn't much left to say. He glanced at the fence, then back at me, and for a moment the silence between us said everything we couldn't. The moment didn't last long. I heard the sound before I saw it, the low, familiar hum of another engine, closer this time. Headlights swept around the corner, cutting across the yard in a harsh, bright arc. My husband's car. It shouldn't have been surprising, he had said Thursday, but the reality of it, the sight of that car turning into the driveway earlier than expected, felt like being dropped into cold water. The headlights washed over everything, the fence, the yard, him standing there, and me beside him. There was nowhere to move, nowhere to hide the way we stood too close, the way our hands almost touched, the weight of everything unsaid hanging in the air. The car came to a stop, the engine ticking as it cooled. My husband stepped out, the slam of the door sharp in the stillness. He didn't say anything. He looked at me first, then at him, then at the fence that stretched between our yards like a line that had been crossed long before today. I felt my breath catch, my throat tighten. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might shake the words out of me, but there were no words to give. The silence was worse than anything he could have shouted. The headlights stayed on, cutting across the boards, turning the yard into a stage neither of us had prepared for. No one moved. In that moment, every choice I had made over the past weeks weighed on me all at once. Every glass of water I had carried outside, every conversation that lasted too long, every step across the yard. The car door stayed open behind him, the keys still in the ignition, the faint dinging sound a reminder that this wasn't the end of the night, just the end of pretending. The fence looked different under those lights. Not like a barrier anymore, not like something fixed and new. It looked like a line I had crossed and couldn't uncross. My husband's eyes stayed on me. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. And I stood there, frozen in the wash of the headlights, knowing that nothing after this would ever be the same.